Persuading people to take the actions we want can be hard. Our teams and clients are bombarded with thousands of messages every single day. But there is a way for you to get above the noise. Stories. This is the Stories with Traction podcast, and I'm your host, Matt Zaun. Join my guests and me as we unpack the power of storytelling. We'll talk about topics like leadership, sales, and marketing, all through the lens of strategic storytelling. Enjoy this episode. Part 2 regarding company culture with Ricardo Gonzalez. I am so unbelievably thankful he was willing to do 2 episodes regarding this unbelievably important topic. For those of you that did not listen to the last episode, I highly recommend you pause this episode, go listen to the first part. In addition, I will have another episode in the show notes called Company Culture Statement Needed. So there's 2 episodes to check out before this one. I highly recommend that. But let's dive in. So for those of you who did not listen, Ricardo is the founder and CEO of Bilingual America. He is the author of numerous books that focus on multicultural leadership and cultural communications. Welcome back, Ricardo.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and I appreciate your time. Every time I talk to you, I'm learning a lot of different concepts that I never thought before, as well as other people listening to this. You know, we were talking offline about just how deep some of these ideas can go, and it does go deep, and we'll get to that. But I want to pick up where we left off regarding something that you mentioned on the last episode regarding culture in of itself as a whole. You mentioned beliefs, values, norms, symbols, and language. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you had mentioned that, hey, no wonder leaders' values are off if they don't even know the definition of culture in of itself. Of course, there would be some cracks, so to speak, regarding the values. So let's unpack that a little bit more. I'll give you some examples regarding myself. Maybe you could help steer me regarding what is a belief, what is a value, just so people listening can really grab a hold of this.
Sure.
So several years ago, I was doing everything I possibly could to study masterful orators. Okay, so I really focused on strategic storytelling and really focusing on how can people inspire, persuade, prompt an action with the person or audience that they're talking to. So this led me to in-depth study regarding politicians, regarding comedians, actors, anyone that is in front of people and connecting. But a lot of this was done from an academic perspective. And then I recognized I was missing a really important puzzle piece to this equation, which was artists in the music industry. And I recognized that some of the best songwriters have very specific frameworks for the songs that they produce and put into the world. In fact, songs that sell the most actually have very specific frameworks. So I started going into this whole avenue of what can we unpack from musicians that can be used in the business world. And I highly recommend anyone listening to this. I mean, everyone talks about creating a tribe of people around them. What better entity to look to than the music industry? I mean, rock stars know how to create a tribe of people around them for sure. And there's a lot we can learn from rock and roll, just one genre, but there's a lot we can learn from other genres as well, but specifically the entire framework process. Okay. So this led me to telling myself the story, because again, stories do have traction in many, many ways. The story of I need to look outside of academia and other different industries I wasn't really mindful of at the time. That led to me saying, I'm very much going to focus on creativity within my business. So take us through that. So we have the story of me doing intensive research, recognizing that I was missing this one piece, which is the music industry. So that's the story that I have. Is the value or the belief creativity?
Well, I would go back even further. You know, what was the belief that you ascribed to that caused you to think that studying the greatest orators in history would unlock for you what? Was it the belief that the power of the spoken word is the greatest power on earth? Was that a belief for you? Because that would have created the drive to go deeper, right? So I'm curious as to what the belief was that actually got you on that path, why you did it in the first place.
Yeah, so to answer that question, I was listening to two speeches, one from Martin Luther King Jr. and another one from John F. Kennedy. And I'm watching this thinking, what is happening right here that is causing this audience to literally be on the edge of their seat? What is happening? There has to be different patterns regarding the way information is being utilized, that language, so to speak, you mentioned, utilized to connect with the audience, which led me to, all right, what is the framework? What are the patterns with other leaders? And all these different things started to come up regarding Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan. I mean, pick someone that's been able to connect. Now, the missing piece of that was, all right, so that was the pattern, that was the system, that was
So
the
was
framework.
the belief true connection happens through the spoken word?
Yes, absolutely. That would be the belief, is what you're saying.
Yeah. So because the belief would drive the rest of your activity, right?
Sure.
So everything else that happened after that has gotten you to this particular point in time came out of that one core belief. It set everything in motion, right? Yeah, I would reference President Obama's speech at the Democratic National Convention. What was it, in 2004? I believe it was. I think it was 2004. Yeah, which propelled him. That one speech actually propelled him to the presidency. Had not been for that one speech, so you can look at, but you have to have a core belief, right, that drives behaviors, and in the construct, behaviors are the norms, right? So what was the value that was created by your belief that the spoken word is the most powerful force on earth, and then that would create a value, and then everything else for you has been an offshoot. Your program and everything else is around stories. But everything kind of comes from that core belief and drives down through. And now that's not a culture, because it's not necessarily you're not with a group of people who are sharing that same belief. You're kind of creating that group of people to some degree, right?
Sure.
But it certainly does follow that trajectory. I don't know. Does that make sense or no?
No, absolutely. So, all right. So what I'm hearing is that, so the belief that I had and still have to this day is the power of the spoken word,
right?
Which led me to believe that, hey, I need to be more, I need to allow myself to be more creative, to bring other elements on board. That's where the whole songwriting perspective came in. So the value would be creativity, but the belief would be the power of the spoken word. Am I getting those two things right?
Yeah, I think the creativity would be more, if you were to structure it in a statement, I believe that the spoken word is the most powerful force on earth. And then you could go, because then you almost just make the transitionary statement, although you would not include it, because I believe that, I value creativity.
Got it.
Okay. And because I value creativity, the behaviors within this culture of people who believe this and value this will be X, Y, and Z. We will practice music because it's a highly creative act. We will practice X, Y, Z because it's, so you could spin it off that way if in fact you wanted to create a culture around that.
Sure. So
right?
this is fascinating to me, because I feel, listening to you talk, Ricardo, there is a difference between the belief and value.
Yes.
A lot of leaders, I think, aren't even putting values down properly then. So my question would be, is integrity a value, or is that a belief? You value integrity, so then there's going to be a value that comes from that as a subcategory.
No, integrity is actually a norm.
Okay.
So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I mentioned that because I've seen numerous companies, some leaders are probably listening to this podcast.
To put it in more practical terms, in our culture,
Sure.
People must speak with each other, which also touches into language, right?
Sure.
But people must be, you know, full of integrity, or it's more of a norm than a value. So if you kind of came back, you could actually restructure what the belief is, what the value is, what the norm is, how that impacts our symbols, right?
Sure.
And by the way, this is kind of interesting. Most people, when they think about culture, what do they think about? They think about music, folkloric dress, and food. Those are the three things that people think about when they think about culture. And all three of those things are actually part of symbols.
Interesting.
They are all part of the expression. Now, sometimes music will express the beliefs of a culture, but they're all symbolic. They're all visuals within that culture. So if you think in terms of symbols as visuals, like in a company, most people think about symbols like their brand logo. And that's like, okay, but that's not those aren't necessarily the symbols. For example, part of Apple's culture when Steve Jobs was one symbol that is immortal is him getting up in front of people speaking in a black t-shirt. That's a symbol.
Sure.
Okay. So dress is a symbol, food is a symbol, music is a symbol. Those are all symbols of the culture. They're outgrowths of the beliefs, values, and norms of the culture.
Wow. All right. So this is fascinating me. And I'm sure this is fascinating a lot of people listening, because there are a lot of companies that will say integrity is our value. So you're saying that that's more of a norm. So there's a lot of definitions that are off here.
Okay. So what would be the belief? We believe all people deserve the truth.
Sure.
Right. Okay. What would be the value?
So the belief is the
we
truth.
Believe all people deserve to hear and speak, to be able to have the truth. Now, most companies don't actually believe that, because a lot of companies are very good at hiding things that they don't want employees to know.
Sure.
Or stockholders.
Sure.
Or stakeholders, whichever one you want to see, right? Most people are very, very, the federal government is incredibly good. So they actually don't have the belief that people are entitled to know the truth.
But if they did,
if they did have the belief that people are entitled to know the truth, then that would create the value within an organization or within a culture that it is important. Think of value as in terms of another word, and that's importance.
Sure.
It's important that the people within this culture are truth speakers. That's the value. Norms are the expectations. Within this culture, we expect all leaders to always speak the truth with their people. You flip that over to language, you go, we expect all leaders to speak the truth with all people in a loving and respectful manner, right?
Sure.
I mean, you can take almost anything, but you've got to get back to that core belief, right?
Sure.
What is that core belief? I mean, the entire Jewish religion is built around 10 commandments. Those are these 10 core beliefs.
Sure.
Right?
Absolutely.
Okay. But it's lived on for centuries. Why? Because they're clear. They're not too many. Right? Anybody can understand what they're saying. And then you decide, do I want to be part of that culture?
Sure.
Right? I think, again, this is why I'm not a fan of mission statements too much, and I'm not a fan of vision statements too much, and I'm not a big fan of value statements. I'm a huge fan of culture statements, but hardly anyone has any. And if there's a work that I think is incredibly valuable that I could help companies with, it's that one, to help people to develop their culture statement correctly. And here's why. Because you can actually get a very, very good culture statement on one page of paper that can be framed and put on the walls and put on the website, and every new person can memorize it and sign a piece of paper that says, I agree to this, right?
Sure.
In your onboarding. And everybody in that C-suite would, from there forever forth, agree on what the culture is.
Absolutely. I love it.
Now, some people say, well, yeah, but we want, look, if you don't have a strong macro culture, all of these, your company will be a series and sets of subcultures.
And some of those subcultures might not be what the company wants.
Absolutely. Or they'll be fighting with different prongs of leadership, which is already happening. Look, one of the reasons the United States right now is struggling as a country in some ways is because the macro culture has become very clouded.
Sure.
I would challenge anyone to define right now the macro culture of the United States of America. Very, very difficult to do.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point.
So if all the citizens, the people in that culture, don't know what that is, then what happens? People feel displaced. And you can bring that down to a corporate, you can bring that down to a division, you can bring that down to a city, you can bring that down to a municipality. It doesn't matter, but the principles are the same. And I think that that's the point I'm trying to make here.
That's a really good point. So let's dive a little bit deeper because I'm fascinated by this.
Don't get me in trouble here, Matt. Right?
Don't get in trouble. No, let's go a little bit deep. Let's have, I guess we'll have some fun with it, even though it might turn a little bit dark. Years ago, that's a great preface, isn't it? Years ago, I had a very, very unhealthy relationship with success. And there's multiple reasons for that. There's nature, nurture, there's all kinds of elements regarding in my DNA to have an unhealthy relationship with success. Now, one of the elements that I had an advantage with is that I live in a culture that values tremendous work ethic and hustle, even to the detriment of myself and people around me. Okay. So regardless of, the culture that America is, if we're going to use the US as an example, we highly value extremely driven people. And there's many good things.
What's the belief behind that?
Well, the belief behind it is I need to go, or I'm worthless. I'm nothing, so to speak. That would be the belief behind it.
I think there's a core belief on the part of a lot of people, and that is if you don't work, you shouldn't eat, and you don't bring any value to society.
I mean, that is definitely part of it for sure. So it's based upon the understanding of the value from a human being perspective, right? I value myself because of X, Y, and Z. Well, for years it was good because I could go, and I could get stuff done, but there was a lot of different elements regarding my identity that was off. Okay. So there was different elements of, let's say, I hate to use the T word, trauma. I think people view trauma as a much bigger thing. And there are different instances that would fit in that category, but there's different traumatizing experiences that we go through that really gear our beliefs in a certain way. And I don't think leaders are willing to really dive deeper with that. And it wasn't until I got some incredible mentors in my life that were able to point to my blind spots and recognize that I was destroying myself and people around me because I had a false narrative of what I thought success was. So again, we're going to go a little bit deep here, is that what if there is a leader that's gone through trauma and they have a belief system that they're pushing on others that don't fit within that organic culture that you mentioned in the first episode, and they're actually causing a detriment to that organism, that organization, so to speak, and it's to other people's detriment, but that is what they believe. But what they believe is unhealthy. What would you recommend needs to happen in that instance?
Well, to them, it may be survival. It may be unhealthy to the organizational culture. I have several thoughts on this, and I love this question. Okay. So first of all, I want to say this. We can be incredibly well-intentioned and sincere and be wrong. Right? So I have no doubt in your progress to quote unquote success that you were very well-intentioned and sincere, trying to do the best thing for you and your family. Right?
Sure.
Okay. But later on, you came to recognize it as perhaps not the best behavior or for you, right? And so I want to have a little bit of compassion here for leaders who have, look, we're all humans. I love what Wayne Dyer said. He said, we're not human beings trying to be spiritual. We're spiritual beings trying to be human. And we all struggle. Everyone. We need more grace in this world. So I want to start with that. Okay. The second thing is I think we live in a country that does, to some point, still value people recognizing their need to grow. And that's quite forgiving. And that's changing. Our culture's changing in those ways. But there's still some strong elements of that as long as people are willing to take remedies to make positive change, then most people will give them that benefit of the doubt, right? Okay. The third thing I would say is that, to answer your real question, is should that person stay in the organization? The answer is no. Not unless they're willing to take where they're at and compare that with the actual beliefs, values, norms, symbols, and language of the company and make real progress towards aligning with that. And the reason it's no is because it's good for no one. Okay. It's not good for that person, and it's not good for the organizational culture. It's very difficult. They may be high performing, but they may be toxic to that culture. Right. And so unless there's remedy, then that person would be better off finding another place that would be more aligned to where they're at, if that's who they want to be and how they want to live. So that's how I would answer that question. Because part of the responsibility of leadership is to curate culture. And curating culture involves sometimes moving people out of that culture who are, in fact, damaging that culture. Now, some people may see that as being discriminatory or as being non-inclusive. We're not talking about DEI here. We're talking about culture. And so if you truly want a culture that is unified and harmonic and has true fidelity, just as if you have to weed your garden and you have to trim your shrubs and your trees so that they're healthy, you have to do that with culture. That is part of your responsibility as a leader in the curation of that culture. Right now, leaders are just scared to death of doing one of their main responsibilities, and that is to curate culture, because they're afraid they're going to offend someone in the process, or that they could fall under some sort of, and it's just stuff that is just very difficult to navigate, and that has to be navigated. The way you ultimately cure that is by making sure that the people who come into your culture, look, I value, I'll give you a belief of mine. I believe that right now, just to keep it then, I believe that right now that Latinos or Hispanic people, mostly women, by the way, are the economic driver of the United States. And I believe that because it's a fact. Okay, but I believe that. All right. The data's there. Okay. Because of that, I highly value the engagement of Latinas and Latinos in business. Okay. So could I go and work for a company that had an organizational culture that would not allow people to speak Spanish in the workplace, for example? The answer is I wouldn't go there. Do they have a right? I don't know. In the U.S., they may not have that right anymore. In other countries, they may have that right organizationally. You have to look at the legal aspects of things. But I'm just giving an example.
Sure.
I wouldn't fit there. I wouldn't want to be there. So I'm not going to waste my energy suing them to give me my way. I'm going to go find a culture that lines up with me. And I think we're spending way too much energy trying to fix everyone instead of us fixing ourselves and then aligning with the groups that best align with us. I do think there has to be alignment, but that's a misunderstood term. What's the alignment to? The alignment's to the culture. And that doesn't matter if you're Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, whatever race or ethnicity one might be. That matters of, do we align in our beliefs and our values and our norms and our symbols and in our language? That's what matters there. That's nothing to do with race and ethnicity. Okay. And that's where we're getting messed up in some ways. To take it deeper, if I may. Okay. One of the things that I have found is that this is tough work. It's easy for a leader, a CEO or CFO or COO, to put this off onto the HR or the DEI department and say, hey, you're in charge of culture. That's easy. It's much more difficult to look ourselves in the mirror and to recognize I may have some healing to do myself. And I have no right to try to lead the culture of this company until I am culturally healthy and skilled. That's hard work. But here's the fallout from not doing that. One is, and we've seen this now a million times over, some leader saying or doing something that got them fired or canceled or blacklisted or whatever, right? We've seen that. And we're going to keep seeing it. It's human nature, right? So if I don't do that work up front to fundamentally transform who I am, how I view culture, how I view people of other cultures, at some point, I'm going to misstep. And in the world we're living in the environment we're living in, it can cost us everything. Right? I don't have to give examples because everybody knows what I'm talking about here.
Absolutely.
Okay. And I want to go back to your whole thing on trauma. I have an example of this because I have a person I know who is a leader, super smart guy, graduated from one of the academies. And every time the word Mexican would come up, he just would, you could see it on his face and sometimes verbally, and he hated these people.
Wow.
And I, one time I asked him in private, and I said, so-and-so, his name. I said, what happened that caused you to be so adamantly against the Mexican people? I'm going to your point of trauma. And he looks at me and he says to me, crying, my son was killed by a Mexican.
Wow.
So trauma can very much impact how we view people from other cultures.
Sure.
Right? That's reality, man. And if I don't, I think some people don't realize how much cultural therapy is like real therapy, right? Because it's life. It's what we've been through. It's what we've seen. It's who's maybe hurt us, who said things about us. It's maybe what we heard from our parents or what we didn't hear from our parents. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point.
So I think everyone, we do this through our cultural mastery experience, which is just amazing because people consistently come out of this and they go, oh my God, I'm a different person. But it didn't hurt because we don't judge them. It makes us, what if I could say it in business terms, what if I could teach you to move from reaching 10 million people to reaching 100 million people in X amount of hours? Well, how are you going to do that? Well, that's exactly how. Because when you learn to properly engage and work with and collaborate with people of other cultures, guess what you just did? You expanded your influence exponentially.
That's a fantastic point.
Right? You not only did you expand your influence exponentially, you now have put yourself, you have protected yourself, you have put a layer of insulation around you so that now you are much more educated as to how to approach people of other cultures, which is going to deeply and significantly minimize the chance that you might say or do something that would in fact get you canceled or fired or suspended or whatever.
Sure.
I can only see good things coming out of that work.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate you mentioning that. No, this is all extremely good to unpack and process. One of the things that I will throw out though, because I know that there are people listening to this that can relate to this experience that I had. I was working with a gentleman last year. So you had mentioned if they're not a good fit for the culture, they should leave, right? And that's a valid
or remedial or
change.
Or remedial. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or seek a process to change.
Sure. Mm-hmm. This person was the founder and CEO, right? So the likelihood they're going to leave is probably not likely, right? So then it goes back to change. Well, the danger was this individual, highly skilled, knew how to produce results for his shareholders. So he was making quite a bit of money. However, background, as he's being raised, parents go through a horrific divorce. His father is an aggressive alcoholic. There's trauma. So back to your point regarding language, the way this individual spoke to his employees, the team members, they didn't appreciate. In fact, on every survey, he scored the lowest in communication. Okay, horrific communication, terrible connecting with people. However, there were different systems, and the technology that this entity was selling was producing financial results for shareholders. So now we have two different worlds. We have this person's a producer, they're in the driver's seat, they're not going to get fired, they're not going to get forced out. This individual is making shareholders very happy. So now it goes back to change, right? Changing that. But that's all based on trauma, which geared this person to speak to people in an abhorrent way. So now there's almost financial dollars tied to it if we're going to talk in business terms, because this person is eventually going to have a revolving door business where people are going to leave. Yeah. And turnover is quite costly. Right.
And depending on how viral the group of employees is and how active they may be on social media, it will complicate bringing in new people at some point in the future. Sure.
So at this point, there has to be some type of change based on what you're saying.
So what happens is look at, again, peel back the layers of the onion, right? So here's a guy he started the company, you said, right?
Yeah.
So he literally could have, if he had been self-aware and aware of his own proclivities, he could have created a culture where he hired a certain type of person who would respond to his type of communication. He could have done that. Look at, give you an example. There are football coaches, right, who are tough, get right in the face of the players. And there are players who want to go play for this guy, right? Because he's a quote unquote winner. I'm not going to mention any names, but examples abound. Correct or not correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. So a business person could, in fact, position himself or herself as that type of coach. Look, I'm straightforward. I'm in your face. Sometimes I may say something that doesn't feel right. But I can't have people here who are hypersensitive or sensitive to these things. So do you fit that mold? Do you want to come and play with me? He could have, this is all I'm saying, he could have filled his ranks with people who would have understood his culture, understood his approach, but he wasn't self-aware enough. So he hired people who clash with that, right? No good recruiter would do that, right?
You're making too much sense.
Well, so he has other flaws. He has flaws of is not setting expectations correctly, not onboarding correctly, not setting the culture correctly, and frankly, not recruiting correctly.
Sure. Yeah. And the reason why I want to unpack this with you, Ricardo, is because I know there are people listening that think to themselves, I have a successful company because of profitability. And that is an element to business, but yet the foundation could be having cracks. And I'm sure you've seen time and time again, there could be very unpleasant things that happen when the culture is based around language that is just eroding and people are starting to feel threatened. This happens all the time with companies that scale incredibly quickly. They come out with a new piece of sure.
Yeah, I mean, our culture's changing, Matt.
Sure.
Gen Z doesn't process their values the same way the baby boomers did.
Sure.
I mean, the culture's changing, and leaders who can't adapt to that or won't adapt to that, then they're going to struggle with these generations. And if you're in an area where people expect a great deal of perhaps even political stance and things like that, and you take another stance, you're going to struggle with those people, or you're not willing to take a stance on certain things, you may struggle with those people. It just depends on, but at the end of the day, the business owner fills his company with people who either will align with the culture that she or he has established or wants to establish. So the great error at the root of things is not establishing clearly the culture of the company, because you could establish a culture where in the language, people speak loudly to one another. You ever been to Puerto Rico or Dominican Republic?
I have not.
People speak loudly. You go to a bar or someplace and the music is so loud, you have to, in most places, it's so loud, you have to almost yell at the person next to you to be heard. Okay. And some people find that atrocious. It's part of the culture, right? And so there are pockets of cultures but it goes back to what we began with. And that is every business owner, every leader has the ability to either cure or create or to curate. Everybody has to curate the culture. So I would, from a cultural standpoint, and that's the aspect from which I'm speaking. Your friend may have all kinds of trauma, and somebody may sit back and say he shouldn't speak that way to people. Maybe what we really should be saying is he shouldn't speak that way to those people because those people don't respond to that. Mm-hmm. Right? But he had the choice in his hiring process to tell people. That goes back to transparency, right? He had the choice to say, I don't know who he is. I have no idea. You're certainly not going to tell us, nor should you. But is he a yeller? Does he sometimes look? Steve Jobs, by all accounts, was not an easy boss.
It's been well documented.
Right?
Sure.
Ray Kroc from McDonald's fame was not an easy boss. Everything I know about and have heard about the way Nick Saban leads his team is incredibly genius, but he's not an easy guy to play for. He's very demanding. Mm-hmm. But all of these people have made a decision that this is the culture I want. I'm not here to judge whether or not your culture is right or wrong. To me, cultures are. But what you're describing is a very weak culture because you have a leader who hasn't set the culture. So now there's rebellion against, and it's not even against him. It's the way he's speaking, right? And language is part of culture.
Sure.
So maybe the culture is stronger underneath because he didn't create it properly. And they have actual more power than he has.
Interesting.
Remember I said to you that either the leadership creates the culture, or, and if they don't, if they absolve themselves from this responsibility, if they don't, what happens? The aggregate of the people will eventually organically create a culture. And if that leader or leadership doesn't fit that, guess who's going to take the hit at some point? Either they're going to do mass firings because they have power to do it, or the power of the influence of the employees will get some of those leaders ousted. Give you an example of where that happened. You'll remember back, you remember Papa John's?
I do. I do remember that situation. Sure.
So Papa John, he was ousted, and he was a strong person on his board, and he founded the company, right?
Sure.
But even he was not above being taken out when what he said was deemed as inappropriate to the culture of the company.
Sure. That is a very decent and realistic example to point to.
Yeah. So I'm not making a judgment on it, on cultures, because you can't judge culture. Culture is. Once you make a judgment on a culture, you can no longer actually understand it, because now you're reacting to it emotionally. And once you react to the culture emotionally, you have no ability to really assess it.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Huh. So one of the things I want to mention, and I don't want to make a prediction, because a lot of predictions that have come and gone in the last couple of years have not come to fruition. So who knows what's going to happen in the next months, years, decades to come. However, I don't think it's unrealistic to think that due to AI, due to artificial intelligence that is in the process of being created, and who knows where it's going to be in the next couple of years, I do think it's realistic to paint the perception, or paint the idea that there will be companies that rise and fall quickly. Okay. So imagine individuals that would have had to work years and years and years and gain wisdom through experience, be able to do things in an extreme quick turnaround time. So I do believe we're going to start to see this, where there's going to be all these different companies that are going to be launched due to AI, due to all the different elements that you can do. But because of the leader not having the wisdom, not setting the groundwork for culture, it is going to come and go. Would you not necessarily agree with, but do you see where I'm going with this? What could happen in the years ahead?
I think you have to look at it, and you have to go, for every movement, there's a counter movement, right?
Sure.
And so for the more people become technologically dependent, the more hungry they will become for human connection. That's the opportunity for the leader. So in the past, the leader was incredibly driven by process and task and results. I think the leader of the future, in the future culture, will be an expert in cultural communications and in leadership of people. I think it's going to tend much more to the soft, because the hard is going to be out there, a commodity. Okay. The soft skills, which the AR cannot replicate, right? But all the knowledge-based stuff, I think we're going to become obsolete, right? Somebody sent me the other day this from the Chat GPT, right? And said, you need to study this. I said, well, I'm already looking at it. But he said, can Chat GPT just go out and replicate your Spanish program? I said, to some degree. Here's what it cannot replicate. It cannot replicate the one-on-one coaching with a real live human being who actually encourages and cares about those students. So we're putting a lot of emphasis within our company with our trainers on the human side, because the knowledge is a commodity.
Sure.
It's the process of relationship that will have great value. So I think if you think about it, like, will Chat GPT, will artificial intelligence be able to replicate all the metrics of a DEI department? Yep. Will it be able to replicate someone putting their arm around another human being? No. And that takes us into the whole cultural discussion of virtuality and hybrid business. And, companies now, some of them are calling their people back to the office. And that's a whole nother, but it is actually a cultural discussion. And that is, how do you implement and develop culture in a virtual world?
Sure.
But we haven't mastered it in the physical world, right? And now we're looking at the metaphysical, and we go, okay, now we've got all these decentralized people sitting at home on Zoom, And how do we unify a culture?
Sure. It's a great question. And to your point about AI cannot replicate love, empathy, or passion. And that's really important to recognize. Now, I do believe that due to technology, we are going to see very young founders of companies skyrocket. And if they don't do what you're saying regarding setting the groundwork for culture, they could fizzle out just as quickly as they rise because they don't have that groundwork. So I highly recommend people listen to what you're saying, Ricardo, because you're making very, very good points about what we need to do, not only from a company perspective, but also internally, individual. There could be elements of trauma, our background, the stories and experiences we've gone through that dictate different elements of our beliefs. So I very much appreciate everything you shared. There was a ton that we unpacked in this conversation. There's three simple things that I want to highlight, though, that I don't want people to miss, Ricardo. You mentioned the difference between beliefs and values. So I know that this is simple. It wasn't like we did get deeper in the conversation, but I would encourage everyone listening to this to really pull up the values that you have or think you have as an organization and really start to backtrack and connect the dots to the beliefs. Where do they come from? I very much appreciate that point you made. You also mentioned when you were talking about the 10 commandments, there's not too many of them.
Yeah.
Right. And we have been able to understand them for thousands of years. You said to not have too many. It's not memorable. So I would encourage leaders, do you have 27 values? I'm using air quotes as an organization. They're not going to be remembered. In addition, I very much appreciate you mentioning sometimes a leader can be well-intentioned, but be wrong.
Yeah.
And is that leader strong enough to make the changes they need to make in order to really carry out their mission, the impact that they want to have on the world through the organization? So I very much appreciate those 3 points. Ricardo, there's a lot that people can get from what you do. I mean, if they're getting value just based on the short conversation we're having, I can't even imagine the kind of value someone would get by going through one of your programs. So where's the best place people can connect with you?
So either bilingualamerica.com, which is our corporate, and or my personal page, which is ricardogonzalez.com. Either one of those two.
Great. I will include those in the show notes. I highly recommend Ricardo's work to everyone listening. It's fascinating. I mean, there's so much that I've unpacked by going through material that you put out into the world, Ricardo. So thank you so much. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate you.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. Please leave a review, since positive reviews will make it easier for others to find this conversation. Next episode will launch on Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern. Until then, remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.